Matthew chapter 6, we'll be looking at verses 1 through 4. We've been working, as you know, through a harmony of the gospel accounts. And as we've done so, we've gotten to the Sermon on the Mount. And we have come here to chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And this is the word of the Lord. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, during the course of our walking through the Sermon on the Mount, we have returned time and again to chapter 5, verse 20, where Jesus says that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says that your righteousness needs to exceed that of those who have been considered the religious folk of his day, those who crossed all the pious T's and dotted all the religious I's. And it's not them, but those who exceed them that will enter into the kingdom of heaven. And so the question to us is, how do you exceed someone like that? How do you exceed the righteousness of someone who has been, according to Jewish law, called to fast one time a year and yet has taken it upon themselves to fast twice a week? How do you exceed the righteousness of someone who, rather than just attending synagogue to hear the scriptures read and taught, spend their lives devoted to the study of the scriptures and interpreting of the scriptures, and in fact, writing the scriptures down, copy after copy, in order that synagogues around the nation have one to use in their times of worship? How do you exceed that? Now, our knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, I guess I've got to try harder. And of course, that's not it. And good thing, too, because you know that you would never outpace them. You know that. So how do you exceed them? Well, it's really not that hard of an answer to come to if you put your mind to it. You know, when we've talked about the Pharisees and scribes and considered what they did, we recognize that what they did is they sought to impress God through their actions. And that meant checking all the right boxes, doing all the right things, keeping the letter of the law. And to an outside observer watching them, this was all really impressive. But it wasn't to God. Why not? Because it was all show with no heart. And we all know what that's like. We understand, even from childhood, we know what that's like to be in those type of shoes. We know what it was like, especially if you have siblings, when mom and dad have told you that you got to tell one another that you love them, and then you dutifully did that, saying to your brother or your sister, I love you, while keeping your fingers crossed behind your back. You know what it's like to tell Aunt Bertha thank you and how appreciative you are for that sweater that you got for Christmas, although it's the ugliest thing you've ever seen, and you know that you will never wear that thing in 1,000 years. You know what it's like to tell mom, yes, I liked your bean salad, and yes, it tasted great, although when she turned her back, you spit it out into your napkin. You know what it's like to do and say the right things, even when your heart was not into it. And the thing is that God is not fooled by outward shows that are not matched with inward devotion. And you can show up to church every day that the church is open, but if it's only your body that is there and not your heart, that doesn't get you any closer in your pursuit of heaven. We can pray to God, but if we're not praying to the Father whom we love, what are we expecting from him? We can say that we believe in Jesus, but hey, doesn't the devil believe in Jesus? Yes, he does. The devil believes in Jesus, and how far is that getting him? It's not going to get him anywhere unless that belief is matched with love and devotion to Jesus. You can't just believe in Jesus. Your heart must be for Jesus. And so to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees is not to try harder. It is to give the Lord your heart, to come to him in faith, for your obedience to be an act of true devotion to him, not just a show. In other words, to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees is to be sincere. Sincerity is the opposite of hypocrisy. And no one likes a hypocrite, not even Jesus. And so here in these verses, Jesus points us to one of the biggest stumbling blocks that people face when it comes to entering into the kingdom of heaven. And perhaps the biggest stumbling block that Christians will face in their pursuit of actively growing in the kingdom of heaven. That is the desire to be seen by others, especially in regards to our religious acts, our acts of piety before God. And unfortunately, this desire is all too familiar to most of us, perhaps I'm sure all of us at some point. It's an all too familiar aspect of all of our lives. You know, there are some things that are brought up in the Bible, maybe once, maybe twice. But the fact that this subject, this concern is brought up multiple times throughout the scriptures shows what a challenge it is to God's people and what God's heart is on the matter. So in Matthew chapter 23, we'll find Jesus later saying to the scribes and the Pharisees, apparently they weren't listening this first time in chapter 6, but he says of them, they do all their deeds to be seen by others. And they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. But you, speaking to his disciples, but you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, Christ. And this hunger for titles and recognition in public life, when we are drawn by that, when we are plagued by that hunger, it shows that we have little awareness of how God sees us, and it reflects our limited understanding of our standing with him. And Jesus is like, don't strive to be called teacher, instructor, professor, leader. There's only one of those, and you're not him. And Jesus will later press the point. You know, there's one thing you ought to long to be known as, and that's a servant. Jesus will ask in John 5:44, how can you have faith when you seek glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the one who alone is God? And John will write in his letter that we call 1 John, that the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And of course, we could go on and on the number of times that this comes up. And there are those here this morning, as I believe there are likely every Sunday, that make no claim to faith, who've not had time for church, and they hear this and they say, yes, this is one of the things that has kept me from church. This is one of the things that has kept me from pursuing Christ. So I watch those who claim to be his followers, and what I see in them is the arrogance, the hypocrisy, the air of self-importance. Because I know that if you really believed God was real, and if your faith really was real, then you wouldn't behave like that. And we need to hear that. We need to hear that critique, church, because they're absolutely right. And if that is a critique that you would make of the church, and if that is what you're thinking, then I hope you are recognizing that collectively as a church, we're hearing that rebuke this morning from Jesus himself. And I'm going to trust that insofar as we are guilty of such things, that we as God's people, we're going to be repentant, and we're going to confess that to the Lord. We're going to own it and seek to walk in step with the Spirit as we follow Christ and do it better. But that said, what I would want to challenge you with, though, is don't let another's guilt blind you to your own. None of us will get very far when we're standing before God on the last judgment day by saying, well, but what about him? Or what about her? You've got to allow God to deal with them. Let's talk about you for a minute. Let's talk about all of us here for a minute. And when I worked at the medical school at Campbell University, I discovered that one of my coworkers was a millionaire. He wasn't a doctor. He actually worked in the IT department. And he had done very well for himself, but he had also gotten some money from inheritance. And he didn't have to work at all, but he would come to work every day because he said he enjoyed it. But he didn't want people to know how well off he was. Most people had no clue. But I'd gotten to know him, and we would spend time talking, and so I kind of got to hear some of his story. But there were some other people that got to know him as well that he wished hadn't. And those were the higher-ups at the university. And they, as you can imagine, were asking him to make a big donation so that they could complete their plans for the College Union building that is now standing there at the center of campus. If you ever drive through campus to see a new building, that is what they were hoping to build at this time. And they had asked him if he would give some of his millions to make that building happen. And of course, with the request came the promise that if you will, we will slap your name across the front of it. Now, what they didn't count on was that he was a Christian. And such a suggestion ran counter to what he knew was good for his own soul. So much to their consternation, he never gave them a dime for that building, but he continued to anonymously support various other needs that would come his way, including helping send many students of ours on the various missions trips that we would take around the world. Now, he did that anonymously. None of them knew he was doing it. I knew it because it was my job to know it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known it myself. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? That they came to you and said, to you, this is just a drop in a bucket. Would you give some money? We'll put your name in bright lights. Well, Jesus says, verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Now, notice that Jesus does not say that we should not be practicing our righteousness in front of other people. That's not what he says, right? Now, there are times that what we do ought to be done in secret. There'd be wisdom in doing what we're doing in secret. In fact, that's what he will say next week when he's talking about prayer, that they're to pray in secret, where the Father will see us in secret. But that's not what his concern is right here. As far as Jesus is concerned, there is nothing wrong with you being known as being a person who does good deeds. In fact, I would hope that that's what you would be known for. The concern is not with your being seen. The concern is with your motivation in being seen. Are you doing what you're doing in order to be seen? That's the problem, and that is what Jesus is addressing here. He puts his finger on it in verse 2. When you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. The motivation of a hypocrite's heart is that they want to be seen. They want to be seen so they might be praised by others. And from the outside, it looks like what they're doing is simply born out of their own generosity. Man, what good people. Look at the good things that they do. But inwardly, what they're craving for is attention. What they're craving for is praise. And as much as they might try to hide those motivations, they often will let them show when they don't receive the public recognition that they expected. Oh, I just noticed you left my name out of the program. Oh, when you were saying your thank yous from up there, I didn't hear you mention my name. Oh, I thought you were going to mention my name in the article you wrote about that thing we did for the community. I mean, at that point, when you're saying things like that, you're playing your hand, right? It doesn't matter how hard you are at trying to keep a poker face. You're letting us know what it is that you are really after. And when that is what's driving you, God steps aside and says, have at it. Yeah, you're aiming for the praise of people, and there you go. You got it. But that's all you're going to get. You have received your reward. But, Jesus continues in verse 3, when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. It's another way of saying don't toot your own horn, but it goes beyond that, right? It goes beyond it. You shouldn't even know what you are giving. In other words, you don't give in order to keep a record, even if you are the only one who knows what that record is. You're not giving for your own sake in order to feel good about yourself. Instead, you give and then you forget. You give and then you forget that you even did it. And that's the type of person that the kingdom of heaven is made up of. And this is where we need to be sure that we're being clear, as we have noted each week, that Jesus, in saying these things, he's speaking to kingdom people. He's not saying this is how you get to heaven. Serve people without anybody else knowing. Serve with the right motivations. He's not saying this is the way you get to heaven. He's talking to people who are already citizens of the kingdom. For those who are not citizens of the kingdom, they need to understand that salvation, it doesn't come through good works like this. It doesn't come through trying to impress people with the things you've done. Salvation comes by faith. Salvation comes to those who recognize that they are sinners in need of a Savior, and they believe upon Christ, the Son of God, who came in the flesh, lived the perfect life, died a humiliating death on the cross to pay for their sins, and who then rose up from the grave, resurrected, now living, seated at the right hand of the Father, ruling over this world with the promise that he will return to welcome us into our eternal reward. And all of that is grace. It is a gift to those who believe, not a payoff for a job well done. So the call is repent, believe, receive the eternal gift of life. It is not try harder, maybe you'll make it. And so when Jesus does talk about the type of lives that we ought to live, the lives that we are called to, and what should motivate us in the doing, Jesus is speaking, again, he's speaking to us as kingdom people. He's talking about how citizens of heaven behave. And in so doing, he's posing the question, what evidences that do you give that you are indeed his? That you are a citizen of the kingdom? And his question is not so much focused, again, it's not focused on the actions themselves, but the heart that's behind the actions. The motivations of the heart. The type of heart that we have from which these actions flow. Because the heart of someone who has encountered the living Christ is changed. They are no longer driven by the same things they once were. Their goals are different than they once were. They view the world differently than they once did. They view what is important in life differently than they once did. And one of those things that they once strove for, but now they see as problematic, now they see as a hindrance to their spiritual life, is the pursuit of man's applause. They say, this is dangerous. What I want to hear is the applause of one, and that one is my God. And it's when we are no longer concerned with the praise of man, that's when, as Jesus says, the Father sees in secret, and he will reward you. And this shows us that Jesus is not arguing that being disinterested in rewards is the mark of a Christian. Not at all. I mean, the consistent drumbeat of the scriptures is that we should be striving for and hoping for rewards. The hope of reward is consistently held out before followers of Christ as a motivating factor in the Christian life. But as Jesus points out here, the rewards we should long for are those which come from God. Now, we may think at first blush that this undercuts everything that's come before. I mean, doing things in order to receive something, isn't that what Jesus has been condemning? Well, there's a difference here, isn't there? When you do things for God, when you do them in the name of God, but you're doing these things in order to be seen by people. I mean that's hypocrisy. You're not ultimately doing it for God, but you're doing it for people. You're doing it for yourself, even though you act like you're doing it for God. But sincerity is to do things for God in order to honor God and to receive the ultimate reward, which is what? God himself. What is the reward we receive for our righteous deeds? Well, certainly there may be temporal good that comes from the things that we do, but what we are aiming at is the current experience of growth in God and the future hope of being in his presence. When we long for that, when our hearts ache for that, what are we doing? We're glorifying him because we are saying that, God, you are of ultimate worth. Everything I do is in an effort to know you in greater measure because you are the end of all things. There is nothing that compares to you. All else pales in comparison to you. And so we strive to know him. We strive to experience a life that is energized by him, by his Spirit, while longing for that which is yet to come. And when we sincerely are after that, then that indeed will be our reward. An irony of ironies, when our focus is taken off of being concerned with people noticing what you are doing, that's when they will begin to take note. When you're concerned with people seeing you, people can figure that out, right? I mean, we know that when we're with somebody and they're doing some good things, even if they're doing something for you, but they're doing it in order for their own ends, for their own praise, for themselves to feel good about themselves. We can figure that out. I mean, we're not dumb. We can smell a hypocrite out pretty quick. We know when something's done for show and applause of man. And when that happens, we tend to tune it out because we're not impressed. But what happens when you meet someone who is sincere? And you can tell that their service to you and their service to the Lord, you can tell it is coming from their heart. They don't care if anybody sees. They don't care if you pat them on the back or give them any praise. They just are satisfied in the doing. When you meet the IT guy that has millions and doesn't tell anybody and just quietly, anonymously gives it away, that's when you stand up and notice. That's when you say, what is this? What's driving them? What's motivating them? What is their life centered upon? That's when, even though your praise is ultimately coming from the Lord, you'll have people acknowledging you. And that's when you end up both at the same time keeping secret and being quiet, while at the same time being lights to the world. And this is what we ought to be striving for. This ought to be our hearts. To not let our left hand know what our right hand is doing, while at the same time bringing praise to our Father as the world quietly takes notice.